I'd argue that King George wasn't quite as bad as George Bush in terms of what he did, at least in this context. Now, and another interesting point is conservatives, Randians, a lot of people who say they say people have a right not to be taxed for welfare, but national defense, which means, of course, 150 countries being with American bases and everything. The interesting thing is, what kind of taxes were the American colonists revolting against? Social Security taxes? You know, Medicare taxes? No, they were revolting against empire taxes. And they were relatively low by our standards, but they were revolting against an empire that was being pitched to them as being in their common good. And it's astounding to see when Bush stands up there on these 4th of July, you know, celebrations, and I mean, it's complete. That's all I have to say. I'm just speechless. That yeah. No, the Iraqis, and in fact, every country in which the U.S. Military has standing armies, including our own, I think, could use another round of declarations of independence.
Would you talk about the idea of a just war, and are there any circumstances under which you would think the state would have a collective right to self-defense?
I don't think states have any rights. At the very best, the state lives at the privilege of the people, at the very best. And again, at the very best, the better founding fathers saw it as a necessary evil, but it's always evil, has no rights. Of course, I think that if people are invaded, they have a right to resist tyranny, and they have a right to resist invasion. But the just war theory, which is, of course, light years away from virtually any American war, is, and I'm sure that Lawrence will talk about this too, I hope, but to some extent, I think the just war theory is actually not good enough. I mean, it's infinitely better than what we have, but there's a great journal article in the Independent Institute's journal, The Independent Review, edited by Bob Higgs, this article by Laurie Calhoun called Just War, Moral Soldiers, that argues the very concept of a just war has done more to encourage unjust wars than anything. And I believe that she has a book coming out about this. Now,
what was her name?
Laurie Calhoun. Now, it's true that when one state aggresses against another country, there's often, I mean, I'm an individualist, and I explain what I think that means. But so I think that within the country, people can be defending themselves. But that includes against their own state. So if the state's coming around to draft you, you have as much right to consider him an occupier as you do a foreign state. I consider foreign invasions overall worse, but I don't think that, I mean, would I believe in a just war if I saw one? I suppose. You know, I'd also, yeah.
So I'm asking about them as a theoretical entity then.
Well, it's, yeah, if there's the extent to which there's aggression against peaceful people, it's unjust. So I don't think any war has been completely just. Even the American Revolution, some of these colonists, their own real goal was to conquer Canada. I mean, we're not supposed to talk about this, but that was by far the most defensible war in our history, but it was also kind of one of the first imperial war too. So, but I try to look at it as individuals. So when the Confederacy was resisting the Union, I don't think the Confederacy was just in anything it did, but individuals defending their homes against anybody, that's just. And so the extent to which the defense effort resembles that, that's the extent to which it's just, but it's just war, I think, is really an oxymoron, because if it's almost not even a war, the extent to which it's just. So I'm not a big fan of war, but again, the more just, the better, right? So.
Like most writers, libertarian writers who are anti-war, for obvious reasons for the past
the green light.
7 years, your talk spent your talk spent most of its time focusing on the neoconservative or right-wing or conservative justifications and anti-libertarian arguments for the warfare state. But don't you think there's a greater danger, or an equal danger, from the left with their philosophies of humanitarian intervention, the Save Darfur movement? I mean, a soldier dead in Darfur is just as dead as a soldier dead in Iraq. And the fact that,
or a foreigner there.
Yeah, and the fact that we had calls from the left for military intervention to deliver supplies to the earthquake in Burma because their horrible government refused to even allow humanitarian volunteer come in for cyclone. Sorry, thank you. And would you entertain the thought that perhaps because of this humanitarian left-wing feel-good interventionism that still predominates on the left, that an Obama foreign policy might actually be worse than a McCain foreign policy?
Well, the Democrats can always be worse. They were worse throughout the 20th century, and you know, I didn't mean to imply that I would concede an inch to the Wilsonian mindset. I think it's evil, and I think that the humanitarian with the atom bomb is not, you know, much of a moral paragon. But I think that if you scratch this internationalist thrust on the left, you'll still find nationalism. I mean, it was the Democrats who talked about the one indispensable nation, and they're still unilateral. I think that at least in much of right now, or at least for the last several years, those who call themselves on the right have been worse than those who call themselves on the left. But really, the issue is, do you want to murder people or not? And I don't think that you have a right to tax and murder people for so-called good and humanitarianism, which, of course, was one of the elements of the... Last year, I gave a talk where I more extensively addressed the internationalist, liberal justification, rationales for war. So I agree. We should never... Obama can be worse, of course.
What role has and influence has social Darwinism and the survival of the fittest had on the way the U.S. has gone to war?
Well, I think largely it's encouraged it. I mean, it depends. I mean, if you really look at, I think that to a large extent, social Darwinism and Spencer's views have been taken out of context by some of his collectivist critics, but on the other hand, this is why I think egoist individualism has its limits in actually defending liberty and individual rights and dignity. So, you know, people saw the destiny of the U.S. both as a secular force and as a religious force, you know, 100 years ago, and it was always, it's bad. So I think that it was in many ways very bad. Thank you.